Hello, everyone, on this wet Sunday morning. Thanks for coming out, and welcome to Word on the Street's main stage. My name's Deborah Dundas, and I'm your host during this next event with Randy Boyagoda and Naben Ruthnum. Before we begin, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge the history of the place where we are gathered today. The City of Toronto exists because of the Toronto Purchase, also known as Treaty 13, signed with the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation in 1805, with a final claim settlement in 2010. This territory is the subject of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement between the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, and the Mississaugas of the New Credit to care for and share the resources around the Great Lakes in peace, which we are now all sharing responsibly in upholding. The Dish with One Spoon was born in part out of the Anishinaabe concept of all our relations, which is the awareness that we are connected to and reflected in all the living and non-living beings around us. Toronto is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit and Métis people with long histories on this land, and acknowledging this is only the first step in building a practice of land stewardship and Indigenous solidarity that honors these peoples. Now, please join me in welcoming Randy Boyagoda, author of Dante's Indiana. Randy is a novelist, literary critic, and professor of English at the University of Toronto. He lives in the city with his wife and 4 children and somehow still finds time to write. He's going to start off reading from Dante's Indiana for us.
Thank you very much, Deborah. Good morning, everyone. I hope you can hear me at the back. I wanted to just say how happy I am to be back at Word on the Street. It has been a few years, and it is really good to see the city returning to its life like this, especially with events like Word on the Street. My new novel is called Dante's Indiana, and it's a novel about the creation of a Dante theme park in an opioid-ravaged small town in the middle of America. It features a protagonist named Prin, a middle-aged, bike-riding Sri Lankan Catholic English professor. And while I am not Prin, I can certainly imagine his life in a lot of ways. And so at the beginning of this novel, which follows on its predecessor, original Prin, Prin finds himself kind of lost in the middle of his life. His wife and children have moved to Milwaukee, where she's from, and he's living in a condo where his it used to be his former college, and it's been turned into a kind of a high-end seniors retirement complex. He's living there with his retired parents, and he's kind of at loose ends. And for reasons that you'd find out by reading the novel, he's eventually invited to join a group of people building a Dante theme park in Terre Haute, Indiana. And the dilemma of the novel is that the evangelical millionaire who is building this Dante theme park is keen to make it a success, because if it's not, then the one remaining business in town, a plastics packaging firm, will be the only way to keep the town alive. It's kind of like a Rust Belt Midwestern town, and the only way to keep the packaging factory alive is if they begin to package opioids for local distribution. And so you can imagine this is a kind of Dantean dilemma. One way or another, this town's going to keep going, and so Prin is involved as someone who's a Catholic but not too much of a Catholic, a professor but not too much of a professor. He's asked to be a kind of go-between for the evangelical millionaire and the people who are kind of working in various ways to build the theme park. The section I'm going to read to you from today is when Prin and others go to a creationism theme park in Kentucky for inspiration. It's kind of a research trip, and this is, and perhaps we can talk about this a little later, this is in part inspired by my own visits to creationism theme parks in America as part of getting ready for the novel. So this is Prin going to a place called Genesis Extreme from Dante's Indiana. I drove 4 hours from Terre Haute to Kentucky along a broken-shouldered highway. Ongoing highway construction near the park, even on a Saturday, meant we had to detour onto serpentine local roads. We crawled and curved around mountains dotted with fading red and green Monopoly-like houses and drove past live-in scrapyards and shady cemeteries and red and white churches. We were slowed down by a big rig hauling frozen peas that had a sign on one back door saying, "If you don't like my driving, talk to my boss," while the other back door had a picture of his boss, bearded and doe-eyed, waiting for you to call him by his name. Eventually, we began to see Moses. Many Moseses. Big fiberglass cutouts, beards blowing in the wind. They were set up at half-mile intervals along the road, pointing straight ahead to the park. Beneath the final Moses, a man in a lawn chair was reading a scientific journal beside a homemade display of maps and charts showing the ascent of man and beast. Beside him was a cardboard cutout of a bearded Victorian holding a sign, "Honk if you're evolved." We drove between the soaring legs of a giant angel holding an electrified sword and found a spot in the overnight parking lot, which was filled with camper trucks. To get to the main gates, we took a bus wrapped in the parted Red Sea, alongside other park-goers and their luggage and strollers and wheelchair strollers and coolers and oxygen tanks and traveling dialysis kits with Roll Tide bumper stickers. Trin's colleague Kyle sighed and put away his phone. There's just no filter to make this look good. We showed our passes at the main gates and were taken by golf cart to a smaller bus. This one wrapped in bulrushes and driven by a Gulf War vet who loaded our bags with his good hand and hummed hymns on the way to the park's hotel, Rahab's Hideaway. So then they go into the park and they spend some time there, and eventually they have a chance to visit the main attraction. We were taken by golf cart to David's Sling. After putting on an oversized Mind the Gath t-shirt, I rode in the first of the 5 smooth stone cars alongside my host, Adam. After the safety bar came down across our legs, we lurched forward and waited for the others to get into their cars. "So," he said, "before we fell Goliath, tell me, what's your story and his story, Prin?" "Well, I'm working for Mr. Charlie Tracker, who, as you obviously know, is the person building the Dante theme park in Terre Haute. And we're here, as you also know, to talk about working with you and your colleagues." We began to move. "It's actually a 2-way interview, friend. You can ask me anything you want. But I still want an answer to my question. What's your story in his story?" We began accelerating. "You're asking me a more personal question?" I said. "About my own faith commitments? All right. I'm Catholic." "Way wrong. Try again. I'll say it as many times as I need to. What's your story and his story? Try again." Now we were moving really fast, straight at Goliath, and Adam was yelling in the wind, "Try again." "Jesus? Amen. Now say it like you RCs believe you eat it." "Hang on. Here we go, straight into the big dumb Gath's head." We smashed through and dropped at a steep pace into a rumbling dark cavern and then shot out on a lower loop. We came to a stop at a sign that read, "Whose son art thou, though young man?" And we returned to the golf carts.
Thank you so much, Randy. Now we have Naben Ruthnum, who's the author of A Hero of Our Time. His most recent works are this book and the horror novella Helpmeet. He's written thrillers as well under the name Nathan Ripley, which you might recognize, and also writes for the screen. Welcome, Naben, who's reading from A Hero of Our Time for us this morning.
Hi, yes. My most recent work is a horror novella. This is not horror, but it is a book that did horrify many people in my family and close life, sadly, because there seems to be a lot of pervasive self-loathing in it, but it's not about me, and it's meant to be mainly funny. The protagonist of my book is Osman Shah, who probably at some point in his life had a career plan like Prince. He was going to be an academic, but he couldn't quite cut it, and of course the academy is shrinking and becoming a more difficult place to work in, and as a result Osman ends up working in the educational technology sector for a company that essentially sort of eats liberal arts departments. It sort of outsources education and uses digital technologies to expand classes and having a perhaps negative impact on education that it disguises as a positive tech progressive stance. Osman's not very happy with his life. The things that make him close to happy are collecting books and not really reading them, but sort of accumulating the artifacts of a life that he thought was going to be his. Early in the novel, he meets the antagonist, who is maybe not quite as bad as he thinks, but in the early moments that he meets her, Olivia Robinson, he realizes that this is a person who knows how to play the corporate game really perfectly, who knows how to use the language of diversity to her personal advantage as a white person, and he becomes sort of fixated on defeating her. So I'm just going to read a little bit of the first scene in the novel. Certain stories are for wielding, not telling. I used to have one before it was taken away. It was more of a joke, a few lines of generic airport experience and television borrowings honed into a minor weapon for use in business situations. But I counted on it. The final time I used it was at the AAP conference in October 2018. 7 listeners and I were on a sickle-shaped couch in the lobby of a generic hotel implanted into the superstructure of a retired castle in Montreal. The couch was upholstered in washable light gold fabric that rasped against pants and skirts and felt like Kevlar against my palm as I pushed myself deeper into the cushion, hoping to discover a secret angle or groove free of the rigid springs that were pressing into my tailbone. I don't blame them. I'd pat me down too. I am always, no exception, late to the airport, sweated up when I get there. The air conditioning freezes it on my face and gives me that hospital or strapped with plastique sheen. Then there's the whole this thing. I added, as I did every time, to the invitation of my smile, with an up-down displaying wave of hand over face. The downstroke acknowledged the skin that caused the airport situation and the unease of my listeners. The upstroke, a toss like I was flinging salt or a spell, dismissed any tragic significance, sent race into the ether, let my listeners join in a laugh if they were brave enough to start it. Anyone who takes pleasure in rendering even brief power from goodwill and fear is shit. When I use this story, I was no exception. I want to make it clear that I understand this, and that it doesn't prevent me from discerning that Olivia Robinson was and is much worse than I am. She's also, in the sense that matters to her and to our world, much greater. The 6 listeners who weren't Olivia reacted exactly as I wanted them to. Mouths balanced between self-evaluating smile and moo of concern, quickly hidden by a mug or glass held up like a quivering masquerade visor. Eyes shy to meet mine and saturated with a compassion begging for transmutation into accepted laughter. The features of these people have vanished now from AAP's offices and from my memory. Eye color, ruddiness, dental details, all gone. Enough of them were white for me to have deployed the story. Remarkable considering the company's diverse employee pool, which Nénazet Barat called a rainbow whirlpool of mediocrity, blending into a calming diarrhea tone when stirred with the correct human resources stick. I only remember that they were watching me correctly, that they were doing what I wanted them to do.
Thank you. Both of these books are satire, and I want to start off with a little bit on satire. I guess we'll start with you, Randy. What attracted you to satire for telling these stories?
Well, I think every premise kind of calls out of you the right way to tell it, whether it's a crime or it's satire. And in the kind of most basic sense, what's satire? Satire takes the virtues that we take for granted and takes them to their extreme and then reveals them as vices. And I think in a lot of ways, that's how I tend to write about contemporary life, is to think about some of the things that we take for granted as virtues and then take them to their extremes to kind of reveal that they are in many ways vices. And so what would be, examples here, the virtue of a small town family business staying committed to its community at all costs means packaging opioids for local distribution to stay fully committed that way. Or one of the other kind of dynamics in this novel is that Prynne is working with 3 failed Dante scholars who never get jobs, and but refuse to give up on their work on Dante. So then they're hired by this evangelical millionaire to be the academic consultants on a theme park. So they can't give up on their academic commitments, and then they're kind of doomed as a result to consult on a theme park in some ways. And so I guess for me, satire is a way to take on things that otherwise tend to be kind of treated very, very seriously and solemnly. Like, let's say, the relationship between faith and culture and politics. That's my way in, I guess.
Yeah, I tend to, while satire completely works applied to this novel, it's absolutely accurate. I always tend to avoid it in case it's. I call this a comedy. It's a comic novel first and foremost. I find that satire can sometimes imply a sort of intellectualism, like and a coldness of approach that is absent from this book. It's a very. Osman takes everything so incredibly personally that his seeks into social commentary end up having, I think, almost more to do with sort of rage-filled stand-up comedy than they do with sort of a cool satire. But the way Randy explained satire just now, which I think is, the correct definition, absolutely suits this novel, and in that it's about virtues, and to use like sort of a term that's been completely hijacked but used to be quite useful, virtue signaling. It's so much about the appearance of doing the right thing, especially in a sort of corporate credo, and how that appearance can be used to just accelerate and accentuate personal power that has nothing to do with sort of uplifting the masses.
Now, talking about comedy, the comedic parts of it, there's also, I think, in both of these, a vein of seriousness underneath. The Stars review said about yours, Nathan, that or Naben, sorry.
I use that name too for my crime novels, by the way.
That's right. It's going between one and the other. That they came across unanticipated emotional developments, which you don't necessarily expect from comedy. And then Kirkus said of yours, Randy, that there was a vein of sadness. Neither of those reactions would seem to be what one would expect from comedy or satire, or is it? I mean, do you want to take that one first, David?
Sure. To me, I think they're always so close to get. To me, I think Goodfellas is a much funnier movie than almost any studio comedy, and that is about violence and exploitation and all these things. You could say the same about The Sopranos. Sorry, I don't know why I'm sticking to this sort of mafia theme, but to me, if something is going to have guts as a comic piece, it needs to have teeth as a tragic piece as well. And in this case, I find I love a comic novel that sort of tricks you, that lures you in. At first, Osman's, for example, his rants about his own body and his dislike about his body, and how he isn't really perceiving himself as anybody else around him does in a very negative way. I think those start funny. That was my intention. And then as they go on, you realize that there's such extreme pain and dissociation there that it's not funny anymore. But then there's still a one-liner here or there that, if I did it right, makes you laugh despite yourself.
I would say that for me, the distinctions that Naben was just describing that kind of come into your question, Deborah, for me, the origin moment was reading Philip Roth's novel Portnoy's Complaint, which, if you know it, is a kind of outrageously funny and kind of gleefully offensive novel in so many ways. But there's this one moment in that novel where the narrator catches a glimpse of his father as this broken, disappointed, failed man. And Roth doesn't make it funny because it's not funny. And so you're laughing, you're shaking your head, you're outraged, you can't believe he just said that. And then you get this incredibly moving moment of a son seeing his father in the kind of moment of mutual recognition this life hasn't worked out the way either of us wanted it to.
Yeah.
And then right back to the crazy jokes about masturbating with a piece of liver and everything else, right? But the one depends upon the other, and that kind of balance is something that I'm very much committed to with a novel like this, where you want to take it as far as you can and see what happens. So the main ride in Dante's Indiana, the theme park, is named Garion, after the monster in Dante's Inferno that takes Dante and Virgil from one part of hell down to another. And the idea is that it's a figure of deceit, an innocent face, and then basically a monster. And so it's a great idea for a roller coaster. So that's the main ride in Dante's Indiana. And right around the time when the park's about to open, a black teenager named Garion Jackson is killed by police in Chicago, a little further away. And so the dilemma of the novel is whether to double down and keep calling it Garion or not, because that's the name of the ride.
Yep.
And as a result of that, kind of chaos descends on this small town because of rivaling versions of protesters. You've got some, they're sort of saying, every month is Dante month, make Dante great again. And then you've got a whole series of kind of very enthusiastic, woke, progressive white people gathered around grieving black people, basically. And what I'm trying to do with that is move back and forth between the serious and the funny, because in some ways, that's what I see in these scenes.
Now, one thing we haven't addressed yet is basing it on Dante's the Divine Comedy. Where did that? Why did you choose that as something to riff off of? I mean, did that?
I think the idea of it. Well, I mean, admittedly, the idea of it came while I was vacuuming out the car one morning, and I was listening to a BBC radio adaptation of the Divine Comedy, and what I noticed, I've read it, many times. You read it in the way you do these sorts of old books, and I noticed in the radio adaptation that Dante was breathing heavily while moving around in hell. The actor playing Dante. Because it's a climb, right? You climb down through hell to then come up through the mountain of purgatory and then ascend to the heavens. And I started thinking to myself, well, what does that mean? How could you write about... I've never thought about this as a physical experience, and it's so physical. Why don't I write a hiker's guide to Dante? It'll be like a book city book you put in the front, and nobody ever reads it, but everybody wants to buy it because it's a clever idea, and then you have it on your coffee table. So I started working on a hiker's guide to Dante with some students here at U of T. And then very quickly I realized that what became much more interesting to me was the kind of comedic possibilities. I was trying to visualize, hell in a way. And then it just very quickly got me thinking about the phenomenon of creationism theme parks. I was already kind of writing a Dante-like trilogy. And so then the two just came together and it became this instead.
Okay. It's interesting that you mentioned the physicality of the Divine Comedy and what you were listening to, because I think both of these books have incredible physicality to them. I mean, yours with the body self-loathing of Osmond. I mean, can you talk about the physicality in the books? I mean, it's the same as in Helpmeet. I mean, Helpmeet is very physical. You've got a body sort of decomposing, breaking down.
Yeah, to me I never write in sort of pure metaphor at all, of course. Like, this is not, I don't want to say, like, the body stuff in this book is all about alienation and distance, but it is, again, what could be more personal to you than your body? And in Osmond's case, he feels very in tune with the inadequacies of his body, but in reality, he's completely different, completely distanced from how his body is actually perceived, the way it actually works. He's almost sort of a rider on his own body, and that to me speaks to how he's sort of unable to get a grip in either his family and his relationships and society. He remains a little outside of everything, and just sort of seeing his body as this sort of meat vehicle that he's been stuck with. It was an almost science fiction approach to what seems to be the most pure incarnation of the character on the page, his body. So that's where that came from.
Okay.
If I had to think about one moment that like, kind of brought to mind the physicality for this book, it would be that over the past 5 years, I have read a canto of Dante a day, every day. It's a kind of, I would say it's some degree literary, some degree spiritual reading, every single day, one canto. And at some point while I was researching this book, I did a road trip through the U.S., and I went to a series of creationism theme parks, and then I went to Terre Haute, the kind of little town where the novel is set. And when you're reading Dante every day, and then you're visiting creationism theme parks, and you go to this kind of rusted out town, you notice things. And so for me, what I noticed, just the point about physicality, I went to a farmer's market one morning in front of a semi-abandoned strip mall, and there was a group of women lined up in front of the strip mall, and they were all kind of very well dressed. And there was another woman, probably the same age, but she had kind of scraggly hair. She was all scooped out, and she was like almost like a wraith. And she was kind of wandering around them, and they were kind of not noticing each other the way you not notice someone when you really feel uncomfortable around them, right? And so that became for me kind of interesting when you're a writer, you're kind of just wandering around. So I kind of went over and stood a little closer, and all of these women were lined up to go into Jenny Craig for a weigh-in on a Saturday morning. So when you're reading Dante, what do you see but permanent judgment, in a sense, right? You go in, you get weighed, you're found worthy of the next stage, or you're not, and you're sent back again and again and again. And meanwhile, this other woman is kind of just wandering around them. I suspect she was an addict, but it's a small town. So then in my head, I'm thinking, well, maybe you guys went to high school together. And all of you, you're in one version of life, of Dante living, and you're living in a very different way. None of that shows up in my novel, and yet all of it does because of the kind of physicality, the sense of relationship, and the way that people move through space. And so you notice these things, they go in and then they come out in different ways in terms of specificity.
Yep. What are your thoughts on that, Naben? I mean, you talk about office politics and all of that. How do you get into that, or how did you get into that before you wrote?
Oh, terrible jobs, of course. I think, I think my career is outwardly quite successful looking, but it remains a constant struggle in terms of actually the amount of money that arrives in my, tax time is always, a dark confrontation with what my life actually is. Some years wonderful, most years not so much. And, I've done all sorts of work across the years to, continue this life I have. And among those was writing social media for a company that worked largely for huge tech companies, but mostly ones that weren't customer facing, sort of uncool tech companies that are, B2B. But as a result of these jobs, I ended up, doing these little promotional interviews with men and women who, made not 6 figures, not 7 figures, but 8 figures a year. Some of them,
Jeez.
just people who brought in enormous amounts of wealth and lived in. They're in the same room as me, but they live in an entirely different world. As much as you're looking at this lineup, and these people occupy the same physical space, but they breathe rarefied air. But at the same time, we're in this room, breathing the same recycled conference center oxygen together.
Yeah.
I became really, really fascinated with this idea of how, especially someone from arts, humanities, literature world, can sort of end up being almost a spy in these larger spaces of that are both more relevant to the world and that are both more lucrative to those who are involved in them.
Now, what do you mean by more relevant to the world than arts and humanities?
Exactly. Yes. I think question asked, question answered. Yes, and of course, nothing is more relevant to me. Nothing is more important to me than literature. And I tried to bring some of that sort of intensity of love and focus to this novel, despite how sad a lot of it is. There's a sort of core love of literature that, even though it begins to be more poisonous and more destructive in terms of how Osman reacts to it, that's as close as this book comes to having a sort of God or a truth to it.
Yeah. But there's also ideas of conformity and uniqueness brought up, and how we think of ourselves.
Yes, I mean, certainly. I think that's probably Osman's one of his biggest flaws is that he does think of himself as being the most virtuous and the most specific, the most defined person in the book. Even if he doesn't think of himself as the best, even if he loathes himself a lot, it is actually his crowning arrogance is that he does believe that he has the power to judge and he has the power to inhabit a higher sphere of life than those around him.
I was at a wedding yesterday, and I was chatting with someone who said, "Oh yeah, you're a writer, right?" And I said, "Yes." He said, "Yeah, the glasses." and I thought, no, these are so unique. They're from Amsterdam, and yet apparently no. In a sense, there's a conformity, a uniform to it almost,
Yes.
right?
It's funny.
They are good writer glasses,
Thank
but
you
also
very
cool
much.
glasses. Yeah.
Now, also in both of your books, there is the importance of family is essential, whether they're absent or only peripherally there. Why did family become so central to you in these books?
I think that's probably it is for me at this point an abiding part of my writing. After I wrote my first two novels, my editor approached me and said, "Listen, these are great. You get lots of nice reviews from the Toronto Star and elsewhere, prize nominations, etc. But they feel like performances. You're not really in them at all, really. Find a way to make yourself part of the stories you're telling without them just becoming like a Nausgard chronicle or something like that."
Yeah.
And so I think with the Prynne novels, this trilogy I'm in the midst of, my openness to writing about my family life, I think, created something more vital and alive for me on the page. But it was also much riskier. It's much easier for me to write some kind of highfalutin literary thing than to write about family life when the stakes are when the parallel stakes are high. And so the only kind of guardrails that my wife gave me, she said, you can kind of write about me and your parents and my parents, everyone as much as you want, however you want to do it, but not our children.
Yeah.
There's 4 daughters in the novel. We have 4 daughters. And so her one request was never, ever be in a situation where 20 years from now, one of my daughters will go, "Oh, so that's what Dad thought of me when I was 10.
Yeah.
So they're interchangeable. There's no mapping is what I'm saying. But that's tough when you're writing to kind of maintain that. But all of those tensions are very important. And then just in plot terms, Prynne agrees to join this Dante amusement park project to make money and to kind of get closer to his family and to kind of bring them home. And so there's that kind of parallel situation. And it turned into actually a fight I had with my editor. This isn't a giant spoiler, but at a certain point at the end of the novel, Prynne reconciles with his wife, Molly. The family's back together, and they go back to Toronto. And for at least a subset of readers, they say, well, that's where the novel ends, with the family kind of reunited and back together at home in Toronto. But it didn't end for me because there were still these people in Terre Haute in these kind of terrible situations. And so imaginatively, I could not leave them aside, even if the family part of it, in some ways driving part of it was finished. And so I had this big fight with my editor back and forth about continuing the story because I almost felt a kind of imaginative obligation and duty to tell that. And there was more to tell, even if it wasn't just about the family itself. Yeah. And so I've noticed the ways in which different readers, maybe saying something about their own sense of family, will say, "Oh, I kind of thought it would end there," and then it kept going. Or, "I'm so glad it kept going because it was more than just family for me." So it's both for me.
That's interesting. Yeah, I think the family in my book is very atomized. Like they're all separate, not in like a sort of cool, edgy way. It's there's also a lot of fiction in it, in terms of how people discuss the very notions of family. Osman's father writes a false memoir essentially that imagines this entire family life in India. That's very it's very romanticized and it has a lot of overlap with the kind of very rote diasporic novels that I've made fun of here and there throughout my career. And in this case, he's quite good at writing about it, and he's writing a diasporic memoir that I think could be publishable. But he's dictating it to his son, and his son knows at least 50% of this is fiction. And his father and his mother have both, essentially severed ties with their quote-unquote homeland and have aggressively pursued their idea of what a Western existence is. And Osman himself he's in a situation where he's not just, he's adolescent in many ways, of course, but the idea of providing, love and nurturance and to somebody else and essentially being able to connect to somebody else, let alone be responsible for somebody else, is completely alien to him somehow. That he's come through life to this point where even though now he would be able to provide a family with a kind of upbringing that he had financially, he can't do it. He finds himself at this point in life where the idea of family has become impossible to him.
So there's the idea. I mean, Osman's heroism seems to exist in his ability to create a life for himself, right? That's where his heroism lies. I mean, is that how you intended him to be a hero, or why do you feel we needed that kind of hero? What did you learn from him?
The title "Hero of Our Time" definitely it's. I was using the same irony that Lermontov uses for the old Russian one, where Pechorin, the hero of that book, he's a romantic hero in all the traditional ways. But as you read on in the book, and as the book's initial audience did in Russia all those decades ago, they realized, this guy's a complete scumbag. And of course, Lermontov, you must be basing all of his scumbag behaviors on yourself while using the ideals of a romantic hero. And in the introduction to the second edition, he said, he's not based on me, he's based on you. He's based on the people I see out there. He's based on the audience. Of course, he is also partially based on Lermontov in many respects. But I wanted to sort of create the sort of ideal hero of a diverse novel. Like, you see books like this that are very much aimed at a liberal crowd who wants to root for this very, very person and wants to know that while they may have flaws, they're ultimately extremely virtuous. They're the best person in the book. There is no definable best person in this book. And in fact, it becomes clear towards the end that while the antagonist might have had the most wicked methods, she might be motivated by something that is actually truly altruistic. And a lot of that was actually based on Robert Caro's Lyndon Johnson books, where those are the best means to an end books I've ever read in terms of someone being a complete weasel, but in the end coming out with legislation and power and an ability to really change people's lives in a nation. And I think that sort of mix of deep cynicism and a pure devotion to what is good was really fascinating to me and really spoke to this time.
Now, Randy, from the first line of the book, riding through the valley, I looked up and lost my way. It seems to lay it sort of fairly squarely as a very Catholic book. Was that your intent?
Well, it didn't begin in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit, but I think I just came from Mass over at St. Basil's before I came here. I'm a practicing Catholic. I'm certainly written about in a lot of ways as a Catholic writer, interestingly much more in the U.S. than in Canada, which maybe says something about just the differences of religious activity in both places. Is the novel a Catholic novel? Yes, as long as no one thinks it's only a Catholic novel. I had this dilemma. This is a nice Dante problem, where a friend said, Randy, I really liked your novel, the prior one, that is original print, and I want to have it on our book club, but there's so many inside Catholic jokes. I don't want to have it with my book club because then I can't, it'll be weird for me to think these things are funny because you have to be at some level for those sorts of things. Mm-hmm. There's certainly a certain amount of faith going through this book, but in this one, I think I'm much more interested in the intersections of, again, faith and money and politics in a place like the United States, and the ways in which these things can kind of be mutually instrumentalized, right? So that you have this evangelical millionaire whose life was changed by reading Dante when he was in Vietnam. And he has kind of no interest in anything else about Catholicism, but Dante really did something for him that was life-changing. And but then he's a rich American guy, so what does he do? He creates a man cave dedicated to Dante. And like he collects Dante stuff the way some people collect cars. And then eventually turns into a theme park. And so for me, trying to make sense of religious activity in the United States and using Dante does absolutely have something to do with faith. But I don't know if, beyond, the ways in which mercy and forgiveness play out, especially between Prynne and his wife Molly, I think that would be where kind of the felt experience of it is. But also that sense, and this is the tough part in many ways about being a practicing Catholic in a personal way, is there's, claims of a real presence, a belief in the real presence, let's say in the sacraments and things. And Prynne's not feeling it. Prynne doesn't feel God's presence, but he's still kind of there. And in many ways that gap, in this novel at least, is kind of the space that I move back and forth in terms of his own interior life. And then, of course, that has a lot to do with Dante being sort of lost in the middle of the journey of what he calls our life, the universal experience of it, at the beginning of the Divine Comedy. So that's also where I'm riffing.
I just want to say that if you have any questions, I think our volunteers are around to, perhaps not. If you want to raise a hand, if you have a question, I'm happy to take it. I've got more questions to ask myself, but if there's anything I'm not getting to that you want to ask these two, you know what? Maybe you can stand up and we can try and do this together. You can put it into the mic. Yeah.
Thank you. So I was interested in the way you're both started talking about satire, but then you start to talk about nuance and the ways in which you bring complexity to your books. And I'm saying this partly because Leslie and I have written about creationists, but we've written as anthropologists. And the one thing you can't do as an anthropologist is to satire creationists. The tone has to be a particular kind of way. I'm interested in the extent to which you have to deny the people you're writing about a kind of reflexivity or a kind of humor about themselves when you're writing satire. For instance, could you talk about creationists who are able to ironize themselves, or can you use satire to present this kind of complexity in the people that you're writing about?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. Because, I think maybe what you're really pointing out is it would just be too easy for me to make fun of the big, dumb, Jesus-loving creationists and leave it there. And so I think the challenge of the book is to set them up as foils, but then not create this thoughtful, introspective, struggling Catholic thinker, around these giant Jesus lovers or something like that. And so I'm always searching in the novel, when I was writing the novel, searching for moments that would disclose a greater humanity where you wouldn't expect to find it, like creationism operators. It was a tough go, to be quite honest. And I say that also because of the ways in which my time at actual creationism theme parks in the U.S., Ark Encounter and Creationism, the theme park, I went to a lot of I spent days there. I went to talks, I went to sing-alongs, etc. And there was a kind of forward, almost armature to the ways in which they kind of testified about their lives and about creationism, and it was very apologetic, as in very kind of defensive. And I kept looking and looking and looking for the humanness behind it. And of course it's there, they're human beings, but I couldn't see it. So where I saw it instead in the novel is one of the main characters, a guy named Frank. He is a Dockers wearing guy in his 60s who loves Doritos. That's who he is. He goes to Cool Ranch, the Dorito fan experience park, for as a thing. And he's working on this theme park, and his daughter is an opioid addict. And so at some level, he's a happy, chuckling guy. And in another way, he's this totally broken man who's desperate for this theme park to work in order to in a sense, help his daughter because of the other option. Is very quickly, where did this come from? I was in Idaho for a festival a couple of years ago. And at festivals, someone will always pick you up from the airport. Usually it's a volunteer. And the volunteer who picked me up was this kind of happy, chortling, Midwestern manure farmer. And he was friendly, and we're driving along, and we're having this kind of great time chatting. And he's very happy, and I think he was a Calvinist. And so we're talking a little bit about religion. And then at a certain point, he made a reference to his grandchildren, and then his daughter, and his daughter's married to a firefighter, and his firefighter son-in-law threw out his back, and then became addicted to opioids, and then so did his daughter. And suddenly, and we're just driving down the highway, and suddenly I saw this completely different version of a man that I would otherwise had just been satirizing, right? Yeah. And so as a writer, I think what interests me is to give you both, and I need one to get to the other, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Your question points to, I think, one of the reason why I often avoid satire as a term is so much satire in the modern day is it's so smug because it implies like a correct perspective from the writer or from the protagonist of the novel of the work of fiction that the reader's going to nod and agree with. And I think this is actually a problem with a lot of non-fictional cultural debate of woke versus based. There's the humanity of the other side disappears, and it becomes mocking someone for disagreeing with you and implying that must come with a host of other horrible qualities. So the way I kind of use the comedy in my novel to both, poke at things in society that the protagonist and that I find absurd or ridiculous, while still maintaining the idea of a different perspective or the idea that the other side might have more humanity to it than the protagonist could possibly imagine, is by continually accidentally backfiring all the time, turning that lens back on the protagonist and casting more and more doubt as the reader goes on in the book of the righteousness of this hero. And if the hero is not righteous, then the villain cannot be completely evil.
Thank you. That was a great question. Does anybody else have anything they'd like to ask? That's yeah, here.
A kind of quick question, and it's for both authors because it was mentioned today. The sort of like the role of liberal arts or humanities in arts of kind of being pushed, like in a way, or pushed off like the modern life. I guess there's no room for like in the book about the theme park where those failed scholars get a job as consultants, and that's like or like just people who have any kind of interest in liberal arts having really no perspective in modern world. So how do you both see the future of humanities and its role in the, I guess, everything?
Great, thank you.
I mean, it's a question that terrifies me because these are the things that are the most important to me are, reading, writing, and the exploration of ideas in this way that, not just since I was educated at the university, but from my childhood because of the way my parents were, though they're both, my father's a doctor, my mother's a nurse, the humanities and the arts are the most important thing in our household. I see, the sort of the dominance of the screen and of technology as not just eroding, but perhaps eradicating the things that matter to me most. But I also have to admit that my perspective is extremely damaged because the question makes me feel desperate and helpless about my own future and about my own viability as a working person in the world. What do the next 40 years of my life look like versus the first 40 years of my life? I cannot say that I imagine they'll be better than the beginning. I guess nobody's end is better than their beginning, really. But when I'm this immersed in a problem, I cannot offer a perspective on it that is useful other than, quiet screaming.
Well, building on that warm and exciting sense of things, I'm a university administrator, and I could make you feel even worse by giving you some enrollment data about the humanities, whether it's here or elsewhere, to be honest. But I think if, and I think we are called to find some source kind of hope in. Where I would point, what I would point to would be the young man who works as a steel factory distributor that I was chatting with at this wedding yesterday, who tells me about the books he listens to as he drives to work every day, meaning books, not, not light stuff. Yeah. I was actually, to your point, I was giving a talk down at Stanford in April at a humanities think tank. Even the idea itself is contradictory, but a humanities think tank adjacent to Stanford, meant to provide a space. So we read Dante all day, and then I gave a talk based on this novel. And at a certain point, a LinkedIn engineer said, "Hey, would you come kind of do a book club with the Catholic LinkedIn engineers group we have here?" And I thought, am I inside my own novel right now? Because I would put that in one of my books, right? But I think what I'm pointing to, and then with Dante isn't just for scholars, right? And that's kind of what's amazing about Dante for centuries, is something like Dante is not captive to the university and to enrollment data. And so if we look outside the humanities, I mean, I think my point is this: I will never again read another Decline of the Humanities essay in the Chronicle for Higher Education or the New York Times. Just read a novel instead, right? Instead of reading about this thing over and over and over again. The Star is great Saturday and Sunday books coverage. Read the Star today and figure out some new books to read instead of worrying about it, because that's the kind of thing I think that proves that it's not over if it's happening, rather than us worrying about it.
Yeah. Anybody else have a question? Yeah, go ahead. It's great.
Okay, now it's working. It's a short question. You both have talked about your other jobs, your non-writing jobs, and I'm going to ask you the question you probably get asked all the time. How do you do it? How do you blend?
Randy has far more demands on his time in life than I do. In my case, it's more, for the past 5 years or so, I have basically been able to just write, with little forays into little ventures into teaching and other things like that. For the most time, I just write, but that's because some of my writing is explicitly commercial. I've written thrillers, and I also write for TV and film. In terms of balance, what it ends up being, how can I sustain work on one project that's very important to me, and also do all these other things at once? And that usually ends up being a matter of careful scheduling at the beginning of every week, and then sometimes obsessive bursts of work. Behind you is sitting the publisher of my little horror novella, and for that was something that I thought about for months and months, and then I ended up writing the first draft in 5 days of just really, concentrated labor, because I knew that it was an idea that I needed to sort of get my hands into all at once and only do that for a while, which is not the way usually I write my novels and longer projects, because I can't afford that luxury. But it's still important to be a weird artist sometimes, and to be irresponsible with your time and just dig into something and do it. And it's always been part of my practice.
So maybe two versions. Version one, my wife works full-time. We have 4 children. And so at younger points in our family's life, I would just get up at 4 o'clock in the morning, and I would write for 2 hours before everybody else woke up. And then I would take a nap on my desk on campus. Public knowledge, everyone knew this. But now that my children are a little older, it's a little different. And so now, really, the way I conceive of my work is that I am a full-time writer, and my side gigs are Vice Dean undergraduate and professor of English. And I'm serious, conceptually, right? I am full-time always working on my work. And then in the meantime, I'm dealing with academic continuity in the pandemic, blah, 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 whatever it is. And people think I take detailed notes in meetings, and I'm really just working on my novels at the same time. So I think it is that conceiving where, and probably my version of the irresponsibility is, I could go right back there and get right back to the thing I'm writing right now like that. I don't need a cup of tea. I don't need my proper pen. I'm always ready to go. And that's the way that I'm able to do it.
Anybody else have a question? No. Naben, I've been wondering how you keep your writing persona straight. You've got Nathan Ripley writing thrillers. You've got Naben Ruthnum writing different things, a variety of different things. You've got your screenwriting. You've got. Tell me how you do that.
I think it's in that the Nathan Ripley novels are so explicitly for a certain audience. Like the audience for commercial thrillers has a lot of different kinds of taste, but the kind that I write, psychological thrillers, I know that there are indulgences that I allow myself in A Hero of Our Time. You know, for example, sentences that run 3/4 of a page, that immediately my Goodreads ratings would plunge to below 2 stars if I tried anything close to that in my thrillers. So there's a sense in that, in which that in my screenwriting, which often is very collaborative from the very beginning. I write often with my partner, Chris Burton, screenwriting partner. It feels more like a job. It feels more like I'm, putting on my delicate intellectual hard hat and doing a certain kind of work that isn't exactly like my Naben Ruthnum writing.
Okay. Now, this is for you, Randy, the second in your trilogy. You working on the next one? What's happening now?
Yes, I'm working on the next one, but probably with a longer lead time. If any of you have read Dante's Divine Comedy, you know that Inferno is fantastic, Purgatory is very engaging, and Paradiso is kind of boring, to be honest. It's theology and the cosmos. And so it's hard for me to figure out how to write a third novel that somehow tracks the Divine Comedy and still keeps it engaging. And so two things have happened as a result. The one is I don't want to be David Lodge novels. I don't want it to become like unintentionally a series. If it's intentionally a series, that's different.
Yeah.
But I don't. Oh, here's his latest madcap adventure. Prin and Elon Musk go to space together, and Elon becomes a Catholic. I'm not going to, right? That seems to me like autopilot. So I think I'm going to wait a little bit, to be honest, and get a little bit of distance, and try to come at the third novel in a way that probably won't involve satire, to be honest.
Okay.
And it probably, it won't be as funny a book, but I think there's probably something maybe more wise, one hopes, that'll come by the third book in this trilogy. It might not happen. Like Updike would write his rabbit novels and then go do something else for a while and come back. I'll probably do something else and then come back to Prin in a few years.
And you? What are we looking for? Are we looking for something from Nathan, from Naben, from somewhere in between?
I think, yes, my next thing will be a Naben Ruthnum novel, but I think it might actually be another a horror novel, but something that is, like my previous horror novel, definitely very human and character-based and relationships-based. Yes. What's scarier than that?
No kidding, hey? Well, thank you both for joining us here on this now lovely day it's turning out to be, and thanks to you who
Thank you, everyone.
braved the rain. Now, I do have a couple of quick announcements I need to make, so be sure to head over to the signing booth, which is just to the north of the stage. It's the Another Story Bookshop booth next door. Well, Naben and Randy will sign books, and you can talk to them even further. They want me to ask you to please donate to Word on the Street, and since it's so wonderful to actually be back here in person, though it would be money, I think, well donated and well spent. It's a free festival run by a nonprofit organization. If you wish to make a donation, you can go to the website at toronto.thewordonthestreet.ca. And I think there was one more thing they wanted me to say. There's an extra. I'll look for the extra. Probably redundant at this point. Yes, okay. On behalf of the Word on the Street, I'd like to thank you. So I've done that. And up next is a conversation with Toronto Star journalist Kristen Rashowi Martin Reg Khan, Noor Javed, and Robert Benzie for a debrief on the June 2nd provincial election. Later, we'll hear from Robin Maynard and more, so come back to the main stage. Thanks very much.